Thank you for watching this presentation. My name is Matthew Ragucci. I am the Product Marketing Director over at Wiley, and my presentation is called Content Compass: Synergies between Publishers, Vendors, and Libraries for Enhanced Discovery. The focus of this presentation is really going to be on largely what content discovery activities we engage with in this particular industry, and I'm going to be talking largely about 4 things today. So this is what we have on tap. This presentation will be 4 sections. The first, I'll be outlining at a very high level the discovery landscapes and the complexities there. I'm going to be talking about the work that publishers like Wiley do to help support libraries and the discovery mechanisms that they maintain for their users. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about web discoverability and our work with partners like Google Scholar. And then I'll close this presentation with some trends, observations, and some closing remarks as well. So the first part is around the landscape. Well, it's a very complex landscape. There's a lot of research done on this, and I share this graphic with you here today because regardless of who the user is, a student, faculty member, researcher, librarian, they're trying essentially to get content or get at content and find content that's relevant for their research purposes. And they have many different pathways from getting, for discovering content, and then ultimately getting to the actual content, full text access of an article or a book chapter or any other piece of content. So we're sort of moving these users from left to right on this particular graph here. And it's important to recognize that there are many pathways to discovery, and that there are many pathways that libraries have control over and maintain and work to maintain. And then there are some other pathways where they don't have as much influence over, but users are going there anywhere. Things like web scale search and Google Scholar and Baidu, social networks, research that's happening there. But that being said, I share this graph really to demonstrate that there are different pathways and different areas in which both libraries and publishers and vendors, really, when I say vendors, I mean library solutions vendors like OCLC or Ex Libris or EBSCO. Vendors also make investments in here because we acknowledge that users start at different points on their journey in the pursuit of full text access for content that's relevant for their research purposes. So it's a lot of things to consider in this landscape. From the publisher perspective, just a few things that I wanted to talk about is largely that it is certainly worth the investment on part of a publisher or content provider to invest in discovery, because in theory, the greater chance of content being discovered, the greater chance of it being used, and ultimately that's going to drive metrics down like cost per usage and ultimately lead to revenue for those content providers on a subscription basis, for example. So it's really in publisher and providers' best interest to do what they can to augment content discovery for content that they produce. Standards compliant approach. I'm a big fan of standards and the work that certainly that NISO does, but standards really help facilitate the delivery of metadata from into these different pathways, making content more discoverable to different users as well. And I'm going to talk about some of those standards and metadata formats in a minute. Adding further to the complexity and nuance is that we acknowledge that depending on the discipline, there might be different user behavior. A seasoned STEM researcher might be a little bit different than an undergraduate who is looking for humanities research, for example. So where are their search points starting, and where are they ending ultimately in the pursuit of relevant content? Additionally, different search points for journals and books and other sorts of materials also exist, adding complexity to this piece as well. And ultimately, as content providers, we have a lot to say over what content goes out there in terms of metadata, going to what's going into the metadata itself, and then to describe content, but ultimately where it's going as well, in that authors have a lot of leeway in terms of keywords that they supply to help define an aboutness of their content, and certainly editors too. They're in control of supplying terms that will fit into a natural place, into controlled vocabularies and subject headings and things like that. So collaboration does exist between library and publisher, library and vendor, vendor and publisher. However, it varies greatly, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, in the hopes of developing some better synergies between these different stakeholder groups, because in spite of the great work that they have done to work together, there's still some shortcomings, I think, that need to be addressed in the industry, and certainly pain points that libraries feel. So the work that we do to support content discovery for libraries is largely with collaborating with vendors, right? So you know who the usual suspects are. I have a few of them listed here, but ultimately what we're doing is we're sending different types of data, so either full text content or abstracts or e-table of contents or book summaries, those sort of things over to vendors for them to deal with the metadata as they please to get into their particular products, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we share this metadata over different format types. Some of them you may be familiar with. XML is a pretty household term, but a MARC record certainly among libraries, but Onyx, HTML, other formats and standards that we use to send this information makes it more interoperable. It makes it easier for our vendor partners to ingest it, and ultimately, hopefully, easier for libraries to configure on their end. We also support text and data mining, which again is also can be somewhat complex, depending on who the user is. They're operating at an institutional level or a user level, and making sure that we're supporting the discovery methods that are preferred for different users as well. So another example of how we send metadata to vendor partners for the benefit of libraries is through knowledge bases and through a format called KBART, which is an acronym for knowledge base and related tools. For a long time, we've been sending collection level files, so anything that you could purchase from Wiley would be represented in a sort of stock model in a KBART file. And this diagram over here to the right illustrates that there's a data flow that actually goes both ways, right? So if you're looking at this diagram, the library has a certain product suite that they engage with a vendor like Ex Libris, for example, but there's a lot of information that's being driven ultimately from KBART files that we produce and maintain at Wiley. So it kind of goes both ways, and I show this diagram to really demonstrate the fact that if there's a break in this data feed, largely between Wiley and other vendors out there, that it could cause problems for the vendor, it could cause problems for the library, it could cause problems for the user, right? So it's so important that we place investment and staff and resources around maintaining these very important bits of metadata because they also they drive discovery, they drive access, they drive usage. Another example in which we share metadata, and I've kind of talked about this in general terms on the slide 2 slides ago, but is discovery layers. And discovery layers are really intended to be unsiloed discovery. For those of you, I'm sure most folks are familiar with them, but if you're not, it's really to help those users go to one place to find content that the library has access to. It's a single entry point, which is great, but they do require a lot of work to set up and to maintain as well. And for our part, at Wiley, we send chapter and article level abstracting and indexing data over to these vendor partners, so some of the larger ones, but also some of the smaller ones as well, because we acknowledge the importance of that work. We have regular feeds. They're going almost on a daily basis because they have to be updated to be reflective of new content that's being produced. But we also have our share of audits as well, especially when problems come up. We want to make sure that that there's nothing wrong with the feeds, or if there's data that needs to be corrected within those feeds, we work to do that as well. But these relationships require partnerships, they require communication. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but there are also other potential vendors and ventures rather with other vendors in this space that we also want to acknowledge, more open source solutions that are out there as well. Again, I can't say this enough. It is worth the investment on the part of the content provider to really do this work to make sure that library sanctioned discovery is supported. Another example in which we provide support for library-centric discovery is through MARC records. MARC is an acronym. It stands for Machine Readable Cataloging. It's metadata that sits on the front-facing library catalog so that users can find content. They're really the drivers for book discovery, and so as a result, at Wiley we provide free MARC records for any purchase of that content because, again, we acknowledge that it's so important to get that content exposed in the discovery layer or in the catalog to make sure that it's accessible to users. And so we create MARC records with our partner OCLC by converting ONIX, which is a standard. It stands for Online Information Exchange, and you can see over here a little bit, it looks a lot like XML. We send this information to our partners at OCLC, who then essentially transform that and into a MARC record. And some of the MARC record fields for those catalogers out there you'll probably recognize in this table, but the point is that we are taking something that probably benefits Wiley in terms of the storing of that metadata and changing it into something that's going to benefit the library and the library users into ways that ultimately that their users are going to find that content with full level bibliographic records with key metadata elements, things like book summaries, subject headings, those sorts of things, as well as persistent linking. There's another story we can talk about around access as well, but a user can't even access something if they don't know it exists. So that's why we place a lot of effort on discovery methods as well, such as KBAR and MARC records and discovery layers. There's still a lot of discovery. In spite of the best efforts that libraries take, there's still a lot of discovery happening outside the library, right? And what I can tell you is that just over half of the traffic coming to Wiley Online Library, our flagship platform, is coming from Google or Google Scholar. So to that end, we certainly want to work to continue to support libraries in the ways that they would prefer and that they're teaching in information literacy courses how to find content that the library has access to. We also see the benefits of partnering with institutions or organizations like Google Scholar as well. I'm going to talk about 4 things sort of in this space to give you a sense of, in addition to the work that we're sending to those vendors that you work with, sending to Google Scholar as well. And a lot of it is actually just based off site design and navigation. But we also follow best practices set forward by Google. We share institutional access information, and also we have communication and partnerships in place with them as well, which I'll talk about in a moment. So one way that we make content more discoverable is really through our platform. So it's hosted by our partners at Adapon, but it's a Google-friendly site design. So this allows search engines like Google Scholar to kind of comb and navigate through our site more easily and finding specific journal content and using persistent linking. So that way the user has a good experience when they find content on Google Scholar to click and go and find the link right away instead of being driven to a general search page, something along those lines. So it provides a single point of entry for all of our journal content. And we also provide links to the different formats of the article, PDF, HTML, ePDF, those sorts of things. And we're also doing this at the article level, but also at the issue level as well. And again, making it easier for Google to access new content and indexing it as well. And that's just purely by site design alone, which is it's kind of a no-brainer, but it's something that we're able to do easily and take advantage of. Additionally, we follow Google best practices for tagging articles. And this allows access to full text even when it's behind the paywall, because we still want to surface that content in Google Scholar if it's relevant to users. So we add metadata tags for articles. We include accuracy, it really improves rather the accuracy of the title, the author, the citations, helps driving to the version of record, because that's ultimately what we want, because that's usage that can be tracked. In addition to that, we also give Google XML access to the full text. So actually, we show them what's in that content behind the paywall, because it allows them to index it as well, and really provides better access to references. So Google has a cited by metric or option. So by having more robust practices in place to support that style of discovery and information exchange, in theory, we're facilitating the user journey that is happening on Google Scholar as well. In addition to site design and metadata, we're also, and content metadata, we're also sending institutional metadata over to Google. We send holdings information. This isn't standardized. I prefer if they use something like KBART to send that information, but ideally what we're doing is we're indicating whether content is free or not, or open access or subscription, to making it clear that you can get at this content or not. For those of you who navigated in Google Scholar, you probably see a free to access bar if that particular journal article is accessible. But we provide subscriber data to Google as well. And so what this does is it actually, if a user is authenticated through an institution using Google Scholar, ultimately what this does is it increases the likelihood that that version of record article that the institution has access to kind of floats to the top, so that they click on the version of record. And the benefit of this is not just to get clicks on our platform, but it's also to ensure that usage is being counted, whether it's open access or subscription or not. It's something that we know that libraries place importance on. We want to make sure that we are able to provide those metrics in a simple and meaningful way. This also, this requires constant communication and partnering. It's not just a turning on the feed and then walking away. My counterparts in the product department, folks at Adapon, and our partners at Google, they meet regularly to make sure that the feed is working, to see if there's any opportunities for improvement, making sure that we're following best standards for Google indexing as well, because it's important to kind of build, and that we acknowledge the ubiquity of Google. It's important that we're building on that as well, and that is through our partnerships. And an example of that partnership is now we have Google Scholar links for content that may exist off our platform as well. So it'll take users, in addition to the specific platforms, or to Crossref or PubMed or somewhere else, it will take users to Google Scholar if that's their preferred method of entry or discovery mechanism as well. So it's just an example of how our partnership has improved user experience. Now, lastly, trends, observations, and closing remarks. Just some things that I have witnessed in my time at Wiley. We support a lot of different discovery mechanisms out there, and I think that the vast majority of these are supported also by libraries, which is important, right? So with the exception of maybe web scale search, where the library doesn't have control, but perhaps they're embracing and teaching it, things like discovery layers, catalogs, TDM, abstracting and indexing databases, ScalComms networks, portals, those sorts of things, we're still working to support them. We're still sending data to those partners. It's really important that we continue to do that, and we will. And we also want to continue library partnerships as well, in making sure that we're getting the sort of feedback from libraries, whether this methodology is actually working. So we have advisory boards, we have user experience surveys. We really want to understand what that experience is and if we can make it better. However, it's really proven difficult to get any sort of traffic analytics drilled down to what library mechanisms brought a user to our platform. So we can tell when traffic is coming in from Google, Google Scholar, Baidu fairly easily. But when you proxy a link resolver and it doesn't follow the NISO link origins standard, for example, it becomes difficult for us to really identify where that traffic is coming from, and it also makes it difficult for us to further justify the investment in these library methods of discovery as well. So it's been a little bit harder to kind of drill into that data. for the referral traffic, that is. And as I mentioned earlier, continuing partnerships, but the user surveys help us understand so much about user experience, but also how users got to the platform. Did they just come, did they know to search in Wiley Online Library? Are they coming from the library discovery portals? Are they coming from Google Scholar or somewhere else? Those are questions that come up in the user surveys as well, because, as I said, some analytics can be a little sticky and difficult to determine. My observations in working here, and this presentation is really about synergies that exist. They do exist. I've talked about how Wiley works with the vendor partners out there. We work with Google. To an extent, we work with libraries, but the dynamic between the different stakeholders is very different, and it's important to acknowledge that. For publishers and vendors, it's about data flows, it's about business relationships, it's about if they're an aggregator or not, and what kind of metadata they can take on, and it's more of a business relationship hopefully for the betterment of our mutual customers, which are libraries. Publishers and libraries have a different dynamic, right? They purchase the content, and sometimes they do chime in and they need help with discovery issues. Similarly with vendors, if there's an issue with Alma, for example, the library can raise a ticket with Alma, they can raise a ticket with Wiley, they can raise a ticket with Alma, then raises a ticket with Wiley. Ultimately, it can be a little bit of a difficult workflow to navigate, because sometimes it's difficult to understand who needs to change what to resolve the problem. And that's something that has existed in the industry, I think, for a long time, that I'm hoping that is going to change. I think that there probably could be more research still to be done in this particular area, but it's something that I've noticed at my time as a librarian working in a publisher, that this cycle, or this three-pronged stool approach, leads to libraries in the middle resolving discovery problems that can be difficult to fix at times. Additionally, I would argue that different content types and access types are treated differently as well. Serials and monographs is sort of content, it's different metadata, it's going to different places, but also subscription content or paywall content versus open access content. And what I've noticed too is that libraries want both, right? They want subscription, they want open access content to service and discovery layers, but providers perhaps aren't placing that same importance on open access because they've already made their money off of open access already. But I would argue that we should be treating open access content the same as we're treating subscription content, and ensuring that that's included. So an example where Wiley has endeavored to try to treat these content types the same is in our KBAR holdings feed. So we send institutional holdings data to Ex Libris, to OCLC, but we also include open access data in that as well, because it should be included because you have access to it. So again, it's not something that I've noticed that all publishers, content providers do, but something that I'm hoping that we kind of see change as we continue the paradigm shift to open publishing. There are some cross-industry working groups that exist that kind of address some of these shortcomings, and one that I really wanted to speak highly of is the Open Discovery Initiative, or ODI, from NISO. This is cross-industry stakeholder groups from the different stakeholder types that I mentioned that have come together to make recommendations that require introspection on the part of the content provider, on the part of the vendor, on the part of the library, to understand what they're doing to augment discovery and whether they're doing it fairly. So we've completed one of these conformance statements, but it did require some time in connecting with the necessary folks to understand what it is we're sending, how often we're sending it, are there NDAs involved, that sort of thing, because we do want to ensure that fair practices are being enabled as well in the name of discovery. So just some closing remarks. I can't speak highly enough of standards. They really help with interoperability, they help with content optimization, it helps with the data flow. Any publishers on this call will probably agree, but Any vendors or librarians too. It's when we use a standard, it is easier to get information out there. It really improves content discovery. In addition to the format and the standard and the way we send this metadata, the quality of the metadata is equally important, but also acknowledging that it's the onus of what metadata is being included sits in different places: authors, editors, content providers, as well, and catalogers. So we want to make sure that we are including as much information as we can in metadata records, but still making it relevant, right? I mentioned ODI as I believe it's a recommended practice, but it's about openness and it's about transparency. So I think that content providers and vendors have a responsibility to be open around what they're sharing and how they're sharing it. And the Open Discovery Initiative is just one example in which we can do that. Also, partnerships create new opportunities for innovations. The discovery layer is a relatively new phenomenon that came about through partnerships, through someone understanding that there's just too many pathways out there. They still exist, but utilizing a centralized portal for discovery certainly has helped sort of move the needle on that. And what I expect, I think, is some innovation happening in the open access space too, to address any shortcomings that were happening, with that data and the user experience as well. And then lastly, two things: the discovery trends that exist in the industry. There's a lot of great reports out there. I think Gardner and Inger have a good one. Certainly Marshall Breeding's library technology report as well, to understand, surveying users, really understanding where their users are going and what content providers and vendors and libraries can do to meet them where they're going. As I said, half of our traffic comes from Google Scholars, so we've appropriately invested in making sure that is a good experience for Wiley content for users, but it is an investment that needs to be continued. So the monitoring of these trends and making strategic decisions, but ultimately the investment of discovery is something that can, should, and probably will exist in this industry for a long time. And with that, I had some references that I consulted for this presentation. You can get this deck on Sketch as well. And I've also included some recommended reading by some really insightful thought leaders that exist in the industry. Thank you so much for watching this. I realize this is way more than 15 minutes. If you have any questions, I will try to attend the Q&A sessions on Wednesday. But if you have any questions, do feel free to email me at mragucci@wiley.com. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.